Brilliant. Please mute all microphones. I'd ask you to please mute all microphones. And I would ask you also, all panel members and guests, to please notify us, the Caribbean Links team, of any gate crashes and or inappropriate behavior, so that any gate crashes and anyone behaving inappropriately will be removed. Caribbean Links's information in terms of our social media details will be in the chat. And again, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. With all that being said, had to get all the housekeeping out of the way there, but with all that being said, I am now going to pass over again to the Isaac, who is going to introduce the Dr. Lennox Honychurch. Thank you.
Thank you, Afia. So this is really interesting because when we first started kicking off with Caribbean Links, I said, oh, it'd be really great to speak to Dr. Lennox Honychurch about Dominican history, if we can track him down and find him, because he's a living legend. And obviously he's very busy. So never in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine that we actually would be able to do that. So I'm very, very, very honored as a Dominican to welcome Dr. Lennox Honychurch. So Dr. Lennox Honychurch was born in Portsmouth, Dominica on the 27th of December, 1952. He was educated at the Convent Preparatory School, the Lodge School, Barbados, as well as St. Mary's Academy in Dominica. His first job was a reporter for the newly established Radio Dominica, where he later produced programs on the history and culture of Dominica. These were transformed into his first edition of the history of the island, the Dominica Story, which many people have, which led to other publications, including the regional history textbooks, Caribbean People. He later served as a member of the Dominica House of Assembly from 1975 to 1979 with the Dominica Freedom Party, and was a delegate for the Dominica Independence Constitutional Conference in London in 1977, leading up to independence in November 1978. When the DFP gained office in 1980, he served as press secretary to Dame Eugenia Charles. He later studied anthropology at the University of Oxford on a British Chevening scholarship. An anthropologist, historian, and artist, he researches the contact and cultural exchange between the Carib or Kalinago people of the Lesser Antilles and arrivals from Europe and Africa. He currently works from his base in Dominica. So when you are ready, Dr. Honychurch, please do take it away.
Muted. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you very much, Isaac, for that introduction. And what I will be essentially doing is follow the program which you provided for me, which begins actually with the geology, the geography of Dominica. Dominica lies almost in the center of the Lesser Antilles, the smaller islands to the south of the Caribbean chain. You've got the Greater Antilles, the larger islands such as Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Cuba, etc., higher up. And Dominica lies in the middle of that chain. It's a chain of volcanic islands because it sits on the edge of the Caribbean plate, which is moving eastward out into the Atlantic. It's an area of weakness, and that is why all the way from the Virgin Islands down to Grenada, you have volcanoes that are basically still alive. Each island along the chain has one potentially live volcano. Of course, we've heard recently about St. Vincent, and the La Soufriere volcano in St. Vincent has gone off basically from the time of records beginning every few years in terms of its eruption in the north of the island. There's the major eruption in 1902 in Martinique, which is next door to Dominica. Dominica had its last eruption in 1880, in January of 1880, and it has the largest concentration of live volcanoes, not only in the Caribbean, but throughout the world. Nowhere else will you find an island or space of less than 300 square miles with 9 live volcanic sources. And this has made Dominica the most mountainous island in the Caribbean. So you can understand that this, of course, has affected the human settlement and the history of the island. If it had been a flat island like Barbados or Antigua, it would be a very different island. The society and the history and the heritage would be very different. But because it is so mountainous, it became the last of the islands to be officially colonized. Not until 1763 was the actual official colonization by the British established. So what we'll do essentially, I wish I had a map here, but many of you all who have tuned in would have a visual idea that you've got these 9 major peaks running down the backbone of the island from north to south. And emanating from those peaks are all the ridges and valleys that essentially create the rivers and the streams. The fact that the island is so tall means that it crosses the moisture-laden trade winds, and our rainfall is extremely high, particularly in the center of the island. So we are well provided for with fresh water through those streams and springs. And of course, when there are the occasional hurricanes, the flooding is terrible, as we experienced some 4 years ago in Hurricane Maria. So essentially, that's a background, a mountainous island. It has 6 vegetation zones, and that's because of the altitude. So because on the coast, you will have a certain type of vegetation related to its coastal position, whether it's the East Coast or the West Coast. And then you go up the next level, which is called the deciduous forest. Then you move into the rainforest. And beyond that is the cloud forest, which is divided into 2. It's called the elfin woodland at the very top because it's very stunted. And then you've got also the montane thicket. So all these different levels mean that there's different types of vegetation, and the inhabited part is mainly the coastal zone and the first level, that is the deciduous forest level. So essentially, that's a very tropical island located between the French departments of Martinique and Guadeloupe. Now, the question came up as to what was life like in the Indigenous Dominica. That is the people who arrived from South America some 5,000 years ago. You had different waves of people coming up the islands. I'm just checking my checking my list here that I was provided with. And because of the natural features that I outlined, because of the volcanic nature, Dominica has been called, mainly since the beginning of, or the middle of the 20th century, the nature island of the Caribbean. This was a sort of tourism slogan that was established as Dominica moved a bit from agriculture and became more deeply involved with tourism, particularly from the 1960s and going up into the present time. So that's why we're known as the nature island of the Caribbean, because of all those features that I mentioned earlier. Now, the original population of Dominica came from South America, from the Orinoco River Valley. They came up across into Trinidad and then caught the currents that flow up the Lesser Antilles. And the group that is referred to, for instance, as Arawaks, but that is now, of course, what they call themselves. This is a European name that was imposed upon them. And because the fact is that there was nobody around to record it, they generally have been described as Arawaks. But the archaeologists, of which I'm part, of course, divides the cultures by the styles of pottery that we find. So you have got sort of the earliest group coming up from Trinidad. You have the Otwaroid and the Suezoid These are names that are given to the groups according to the type of pottery that they produced. And you have the Cedrosian saladoid, because the way they do it is that Saladeo is a place on the Orinoco River, and it produces produced a particular type of pottery. And when you find that pottery in Grenada, in St. Lucia, Dominica, going up, Guadeloupe, Antigua, you call it saladoid. And then it gets another style because it's reflected in findings in cedros on the coast of Trinidad. So you now have Cedrosian saladoid. And that's the way in which the different styles represent the different cultures. Now, the final group to have come into the islands are the ones that were called Caribs. But this was a misnomer, because it wasn't until the 1650s that French missionaries who were investigating the background of the people that they met were told quite clearly by them that we are not called Caribs. It's the Europeans that came and called us Caribs, but we are the Kalinago. And so gradually, since the 1970s, we have found ourselves using the term Kalinago rather than Carib. And most importantly, once again, because of our mountainous nature, because of the difficulty of colonization by Europeans of Dominica, the indigenous Kalinago people remained here for longer than anywhere else. So that is why on the eastern coast of Dominica, there is the Kalinago territory. That was its foundation as a formal part of Dominican politics and society, originates in 1903, when in July 1903, the British administrator, Hesketh Bell, who had an interest in anthropology, appealed to the colonial office to set up what he called a reserve. It's no longer called a reserve, it's called a territory. And he followed on from the traditional chieftaincy, which existed before. I recognized the chief and all the chiefs that followed on from him. And today, it's all integrated into the local government system, so that every 5 years, the people of the territory vote for a chief, and every 3 years, they vote for councillors. And every 5 years, more or less, they vote for a parliamentary representative who sits in the Dominica House of Assembly and is usually made a minister of government. It could be for purely Kalinago affairs, but more recently, these representatives, they do the Kalinago affairs department, but they are also in things like environment, national parks, and that kind of thing. So the indigenous traditions of Dominica are very much alive. The young Kalinago people in the territory are very interested in rediscovering their roots. They participate with visiting archaeologists, not only in Dominica, but elsewhere in the Caribbean. They participate in archaeological digs and explorations. So a whole new revolution has taken place. This kind of interest did not exist before the 1970s. They lived their isolated life, they did their farming and their fishing. But as the younger people started going to secondary school, to high school, as they went to the University of the West Indies, their interest and their awareness increased. And so that is why we have such an active community within the Kalinago territory today. And they move now, we go on to European and African arrivals into the island. Let me just say that in 1660, in March of 1660, the French and the British, well, English, because Britain was not yet a formal entity, the English and the French met the leading Kalinago people from St. Vincent and Dominica. They met them in St. Kitts, and they signed what was called the Treaty of St. Christopher. And the idea was that St. Vincent and Dominica would be left forever in perpetuity to the indigenous people. That was the agreement. But what happened is that as the price of sugar and the value of sugar increased during the late 17th century and into the 18th century, the greed to possess these islands intensified. And then eventually in 1763, 100 years after that treaty had been agreed on, Britain took over Dominica and also St. Vincent, but we're talking about Dominica, so I will stick to that. And so when the British took over, they brought out their surveyors and they wrote into the map a little portion of land in the corner of the island for the Caribs. And that was the beginning of what eventually became today roughly 4,000 acres of Kalinago territory lands. Now, once the British had taken over, what happened was their aim was to subdivide the land, sell it for sugar plantations, and establish sugar plantations as was happening elsewhere in the Caribbean. It had started in Barbados since the 1640s, moved into Jamaica in the 1650s and so. But then Dominica was late in the business. So they cut up these pieces of land, particularly the ones along the coast and in the valleys, and they created these plantations. And by that time, to work these plantations, they had large numbers of enslaved Africans that were brought across. Now, Dominica was a new colony, and what they attempted to do, that's the British, when I say they, the British needed to kind of encourage business. And so they declared Roseau, the capital, and Portsmouth, the other town, free ports. And so enslaved people and other produce were brought into these ports, and ships of all nations could come and trade. And so, although we have figures saying that from 1763, 1765, until the end of the slave trade in 1807, that over 100,000 Africans were brought to Dominica. When you look more closely at the figures, because it was a free port, many of those Africans were transshipped to other places. And of course, the cultural patterns were extremely mixed. We're talking of cultural groups that range from what is today's Senegal all the way down into Angola. And therefore, what we find is, and we trace it, there's a group of us that are trying to trace those African links in every possible kind of way. It comes out in language, because there are words that, Zeb Guinea is a grass. And it was a grass that was brought from Africa to feed cattle. And Guinea, of course, the coast of Guinea. Zeb is the Creole, the French Creole for grass. So this is Guinea grass, And you find, I'm just using one example, but there are many. There's a favorite meal that Dominicans enjoy that is called akra. Like, could be a saltfish akra, could be a fish akra, but there's also a titiri akra. Titiri is a form of very small fish, rather like fry. And so they take the African word akara, which is a sort of bean cake. It's brought across the Caribbean, across the Atlantic. They use it in the Caribbean, but they change it to akra. So you have a titiwi akra. And titiwi is a Kalinago Carib name. So you have a Kalinago name linked with a Twi and Yoruba name, Akara. So, there are all of these little traces, little clues that show you about. So essentially what happened is that the pattern of enslavement in Dominica followed on from the pattern that had already been established 100 years before in places like Barbados and Jamaica. And so the effects of the slave trade was to bring in thousands of Africans. They, in turn, because there were many hundreds of Kalinago people there, they were not enslaved. They were free to roam as they wished. They more or less congregated on the east coast of the island, and they were not enslaved, because by that time it was felt that it was worthless. It was not profitable to enslave indigenous people because they had a custom. It was more profitable to get them to provide game, like fish and stuff from the forest, or to make canoes to provide the plantations, than to enslave them. And so they lived basically ignored, if you wish, on the island. But what they did is they passed on a lot of their knowledge of the wildlife, of the nature of the island, to the African arrivals. So today we have many aspects of Kalinago life that in fact are carried on by the descendants of those original people who came from Africa and were enslaved. So there's an interesting mix that is happening there. The other thing that happened as a result of Dominica's late colonization is that a lot of people of African descent in Martinique and Guadeloupe were already free people. And they came across to Dominica, and they themselves purchased slaves. So in Dominica, the pattern was that you had a lot of people of African descent or mixed descent with the Europeans, and they were slave owners. So you had what Dominica had the largest free people of color, group of free people of color who were slave holders. Now, this created a lot of dissension later on in the history of Dominica, because it was only natural that the descendants of the enslaved would look askew at what they call the Grand Mulat, the Grand Mulattoes, who were owners of land and all. And if you go and look at some of the paintings of an Italian artist who lived in Dominica at the time, whose name is Agostino Brunias, he paints these people of color, landholders, slave owners, etc. So this was a very important part of society. So you had your white, mainly British, and a few French. You had your free people of color who were owners of plantations and slaves. And then you had your large numbers of enslaved people, and then your smaller few hundred members of the Kalinago community who still survived in isolation. So it's a very unusual society when you relate it to the rest of the Caribbean. Once again, I'm just going to try to track down this. This lists that we have here. So I was asked to talk about the effects of the slave trade in Dominica. What impact did people of Black African descent have on Dominica? This is the request, and I make mention of the fact that there was a great cultural infusion. Remember these many different groups from along the 2,000 miles of the coast of, or more of the coast of West Africa, and they all came together. And so you find that the music, the dance, the food, the dress, all of these things merged in what we call today the Creole life of Dominica. The dances, the songs, even the language, because you had a lot of French settlers come in the early days, and they were all around in the plantations. The enslaved people were communicating in this so-called dialect, which today is considered a language, the Creole language. And so you have the French, you have the African language patterns, and some of the British language patterns all mixed together in this, and the dress. So that Creole culture is essentially what came out of that. The impact, what impact did the people of African descent have on Dominica? And essentially what it was the whole cultural makeup. the knowledge of the plants and herbs that existed in Africa, as well mixing with the Kalinago knowledge of the plants in Dominica. And you have some amazing mixes. And we mustn't forget too, that plants from the Caribbean went and became important domestic plants in West Africa, things like cassava and maize, the interchange of yam, the yams from Africa, and then the local yams from the forests of Dominica. So there's some amazing change and meshing in there. So the question now jumps to when did Dominica gain its independence, and what factors leads to Dominica being granted independence. So we must remember the post-war period. We have to remember the Second World War is over. Britain realizes her empire is not what it was, and that a completely new perspective has to be taken. The first one to go was India. And after India, the Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of England, of Britain, he said in Africa, there is a wind change blowing across Africa. And sure enough, it was the wind of independence and change. So during the 1960s, beginning with Jamaica and Trinidad in the Caribbean, and then into the 70s, with places like Grenada, and in 1978, Dominica, one by one, very quickly, like a set of dominoes, the islands became independent one after the other. Now, when I was on the group of delegates to go and negotiate for independence, and I'm the last living one. All the others have passed on, including the last one, Patrick John, the first Prime Minister of Dominica. His funeral will be this Wednesday coming up. What happened is that it was clear that the British really just wanted to get rid of as many colonies as possible. Ironically, with Brexit, at that time in the 70s, they wanted to concentrate on Europe. And they didn't want to be dragged down by having to support or maintain a lot of little colonies as in the past that were not bringing the profits that they used to bring. And increasingly, they were, as in the case of Dominica, granting more rights for elections and voting, more rights for self-government. All of these things were happening. And that's the way that we moved to independence. So let's go back to the Second World War. Just before the Second World War, in the 1930s, the Caribbean was a flash place for riot and strike. The people of the British West Indies felt that they had been denied for over 100 years since emancipation. They had been denied sort of the full rights of citizenship. And in the 1930s, you had these riots and strikes. And the British government realized that something had to be done. They sent out a commission of inquiry under Lord Moyne, and they went to every island and they questioned. And the report that they produced was so damning. They handed it to the Colonial Office in 1940, but the war had broken out, and they felt that Hitler would use this damning report as propaganda against the British. And so they banned the report. Essentially, they did not publish it until 1945. And then from 1945, we see everything speeding up. So in 1951, Dominica was given what they call universal suffrage. Everybody over the age of 21 could vote, because before that, you had to earn or own enough to be able to vote. So 1951, then you had your political parties. You had your attempt at federation. Federation collapsed. And then what do you do with these little islands, Britain was asking. So they gave them internal self-government. And then with the freedom to ask for independence at any time. And that's what Dominica did. And instead of doing like the other British West Indian islands and going with the monarchy for a few years, like Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, going for a few years with the monarchy at a governor general, and then becoming republics, we decided to go a republic immediately, full time, before, at the time of independence. And that's what we did, just to clear the decks. And of course, it always is an issue now, you know, in Barbados, there's also all this discussion going on. But if they had done it at independence, they probably would have had an easier path. So all of this assisted us in getting independence in 1978. The British were quite keen to hand us our independence. All they wanted to find out is what kind of constitution do we want, put it together, and send us off. And so Princess Margaret came out on the night of the 2nd of November, 1978, and at midnight, Dominica had its independence, which it has had ever since. So that's how we got independence in a nutshell. And then there was a question, maybe this should have been dealt with earlier. When did Dominica become the first and only British colony in the Caribbean to have a Black-controlled legislature? Please, can you tell us about this? Okay, I mentioned earlier about the free people of color who were slave owners and estate owners, very educated people. And what happened is they began putting pressure on the British government. They said, look, we are educated, we've got land, we are taxpayers, and we are entitled to have representation. And the British government eventually passed in 1831 something which has been nicknamed the Brown Privilege Bill, which gave complete freedom of rights, full rights, to people of color. So it abolished racial discrimination in Dominica in 1831. And what happened is immediately, by the next 2 elections, those free people of color, who were known as the mulatto ascendancy, because you see they were taking over from the whites after emancipation. The whites were pulling out of Dominica. The free people of color were then taking over those white plantations in many cases. And they then became the first legislature in the entire British Empire to have a majority of people of color. And that was gained in 1836. And besides that, there was a guy called James Garraway. His family are still in Dominica, descendants still in Dominica. And he was given the position essentially of governor, the representative of the Queen. And he also is the first man, it's described as the first man of African descent in any member of the British Empire to be head of government, to represent the Queen, Victoria, to represent the Queen. And this was all because of the fact that there was this large body of free people of color who had established themselves in Dominica from the years before. And of course, what happened, just a little addition, but I won't go into detail, in the 20th century, a conflict developed between the Black working class and what they call the mulatto elite. And that is one of the things they threw at Eugenia Charles when she was trying to form her Dominica Freedom Party and when she was trying to get elected. The Black working class leaders were saying, oh, what are you going to go and do and go and elect one of the members of the mulatto elite? And part of the challenge of the Dominica Freedom Party was to convince people that this did not come into it, that they had the goodwill of the country at heart. And eventually in 1980, they got elected. But it did cause a schism for many, many years. We have question number 9. How, if at all, do you think Dominica has been affected by climate change? Has the flora and fauna of Dominica been affected in any way? Well, we've seen the hurricanes. We've heard the Prime Minister of Dominica back 4 years ago talk at the United Nations and explain that climate change, which is created by these major industrial countries, are actually punishing and having very heavy effect through the storms, the flooding, because it's not only wind, it's the heating up of the ocean, which then creates the evaporation of the ocean. We have the trade winds bringing these heavy clouds towards us. Precipitation takes place. The countryside is flooded. The towns and villages are ripped apart. So climate change is very, very real. And there's always the move within our forestry and wildlife department to ensure that the watersheds, water is so important, that the watersheds of Dominica around the central volcanic peaks are protected. So we've got all that legislation. Back in 1975, we created the National Park Act so that there are certain 3 major national parks in Dominica. There's also the forestry department, where you have the forest reserves to protect the watersheds so that the fresh water that is needed for the people along the coastal fringe will remain fresh and clean. So all these effects of climate change we are having to deal with on a daily basis. And then the questions of climate change, and what relationship does Dominica have with other Caribbean countries? Well, of course, we are a member of CARICOM, the Caribbean community. But more importantly, and the one that is more active than CARICOM, is the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, with its headquarters in St. Lucia. And we are very closely tied. All of our, for instance, the drugs necessary for our healthcare system, we buy it in bulk. All of these islands, for instance, are together. The list is there: Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Dominica, Antigua, and Barbuda, Nevis, and St. Kitts, Anguilla. All of these places unite in many cases. All of us have cards that allow us to go and have unrestricted residency in any of our fellow islands. We cannot have it in Barbados because Barbados is not a member of the OECS. We cannot have it in Jamaica. But once we go to an OECS member, we have all of these advantages. So our links with the other islands of the Caribbean are on different levels, you know. And we who are in between Martinique and Guadeloupe, we have special relationships with the French as a result of that. And the final one I see here is, what do you think is the future for the beautiful island of Dominica? Music, culture, protecting indigenous people, etc. So essentially what it is you've got to maintain as much as possible awareness, knowledge, artifacts, information. All of these things are vital because, you know, they disappear if they're not kept alive. And the problem, of course, that we have is that we are so close to the United States of America. Once upon a time, we were highly influenced by the United Kingdom, but now increasingly the attention is shifted to the US. And now with social media, it pours in. It's not just a matter of television, it's social media. Everybody on their phone in every village has all of this stuff pumping out from the US. And it's really creating a kind of cultural crisis. But there are people who are dedicated to maintaining and keeping alive the song, the music, the history, the heritage, and even the natural heritage, knowledge of the plants, names of the trees. All of these things have to be kept alive if we are to understand the island upon which we live. So I thank you for that. I probably have gone well over my time. Thank you for questions. I don't know what stage now this will. I was trying to talk and to read all of these little bits of information here about the Dominica story. Can you tell us about the Neg Mahon? Well, that's extremely important. I've written an entire book about the enslaved persons who escaped into the mountains and created society up there. It's a book called In the Forests of Freedom, published in Britain by Papillot Press. And it basically is a history of Dominica, but it focuses entirely on the Maroons, who helped to, in a way, liberate the people, because by creating this destabilization in the mountains, the authorities were more or less forced and persuaded to free up the system, which may not have happened as early if they had not existed. And we have a whole raft of names of chiefs: Bala, Kongore, Farcel, Hill, women as well, Angelique, Calypso, Victory. All of these names of people who were in the forests and who really fought for the liberation of the people. Key among them is the longest serving chief, known as Jacko. He was killed in July of 1814, and he had been in the forest for over 40 years. He was the sort of chief inspiration for the other younger Maroon chiefs. So yes, Maronage had a very important part to play in Dominica. And we talk here about the use of Creole. I see somebody said, can you tell us about the history and the use of Creole and current efforts to preserve it? Well, the Creole came to us because although the Kalinago were in charge of Dominica, there were people who were coming in across the channel from Martinique and Guadeloupe. And they came in and they mixed even before the British came, and they began communicating in this French, and it has many Kalinago words in it as well, words for plants and animals and whatever. So all of this became the Creole. Then the Africans arrived and they used the Creole as a communication, because they themselves had all of these different language groups, whether it was Yoruba, Hui, Igbo, Ibibo, wherever they were from, they could not communicate with each other. So they used this central language, the Creole, to communicate with each other. Now, of course, with English being introduced so heavily in the schools, once again with the United States influence, a lot of it is being lost. The number of Creole speakers declining. But once again, you have groups, Committee pour Études Creole, for instance, who works very hard at trying to ensure that knowledge and awareness and the continuing of speakers is promoted. Every day we have the news in Creole, so you can listen to the news in English, and then you have Creole, you have Experience Creole, in which people discuss things in Creole about current affairs and what is going on. Yes, and somebody says, I think Dr. Honychurch is responding to questions. People have typed in the chat. Well, yes, exactly. That's what I'm doing, because this is what is before me, and I'm trying to respond to the wishes of the audience. Because, of course, if we were going to go chronologically, which we didn't do this afternoon, you'd be going indigenous people, arrival of the British, the enslavement of Africans, the arrival of Africans, and then going on through periods of time throughout this 18th and 19th and 20th century. But I really responded to the main questions that was put before me. Good. Fast. So, as I said, you probably in Britain, those of you all who don't have it, my book, there was no history of Dominica at the time when I was in my 20s, and I felt that it was necessary. I didn't know sufficient, and so I went on the radio, and I had these radio programs every day, another episode, just 8-10 minutes, and out of that came the book, the Dominica Story, which was published by Macmillan's, and I have here Dominica's Story. And then that now resulted in in that resulted in textbooks that are used up and down the Caribbean schools. So we have book 1, which deals with the indigenous people, and then book 2, which deals with African arrivals and plantations, Caribbean people, book 2, and the whole business of the African culture and how it touched on the islands of the Caribbean. And then book 3 basically takes us up to the independence era, and of course the arrival of indentured labor after emancipation. The Portuguese, the Chinese, the East Indians mainly, who were the largest group. That's why we have East Indian dancing going on the back. And of course, works like Bob Marley, Caribbean Development Bank, and all of these things. So that students, as they move up, each book gets a little more complex, a little more involved, a little more detailed. So that's how my production came. A question of them still being in print. They probably are. And if you go on Amazon, you probably would be able to find them. So that's basically it. It's 1:29 where I am. So it should be like almost 6:30 by you.
Yeah, it's 6:29. Just very quickly. Yes, it's about to turn 6:30. Yeah, just very quickly, just before Dr. Honychurch very kindly answers any further questions, can we please just give a huge clap? And I know Isaac will also want to say thank you as well, but can we just give a huge, warm Caribbean Links clap to the living legend, Dr. Lennox Honychurch, for so kindly agreeing to speak this evening and for giving us all this brilliant knowledge. Thank you so much, Dr. Honychurch. It is extremely appreciated. I'm just going to pass over to Isaac.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
I shy away from things like living legend and all of that. I just try to do, what we can do to, maintain the knowledge and the information, both within Dominica and across the diaspora within the region. But thank you for the accolade anyway. I see people asking to be unmuted. They're requesting to be unmuted.
Okay, we can do that. Or people can also type as well. That's fine. I will see how I can unmute. You give me just a few moments.
I have a question here. I see the greatest opportunity for Dominica, and what advice do you have for the Dominica diaspora? Well, essentially, it's to, keep in touch, essentially know what's going on. And increasingly, when we talk about climate change, seeing what can be done to assist when the country is hit by hurricane. We have one coming up near us this week. It's Hurricane Sam, and we are hoping it will not come into the islands, but it will pass during the course of the week along Dominica. I see a hand up with Peter later. I am not controlling any of this, so I'm just mentioning that Peter Letin has a hand up, and I assume that this means that he would like to ask a question.
Okay, just one moment. Is it possible for people who would like to ask a question to please unmute themselves? Is that possible?
I see a question here about reparations. So I may answer it. I'm on the committee, the Reparations Committee of Dominica. Essentially, we know all the issues, we know the tragedy and all that, but what we have to understand is this is essentially a court case. And in court cases, you have to present evidence. You can say how terrible it all was. You can conjure up the the devastation to the communities and to the people. I, as a historian, my eyes just open up sometimes when I read of the cruelty that was imposed on people. But essentially, if CARICOM is going to be approaching the British government, they have to approach them with evidence, recorded evidence. So what I have done as a member of the committee is I have put together both, because we are responsible both for the Kalinago and for the people of African descent. So put together breaches of treaties, for instance, with the Kalinago, and then evidence of, and we have it all there because of the records of the violations against the people of African descent within Dominica. Now, every country is supposed to put together one of those. So in the case of Dominica, for instance, we even have court cases. There is a book that is published by Papillot Press, which has outlet in Britain and in Dominica. There's a particular book, it's not very large, and it's called Your Time is Done Now. And it is the verbatim account of the trials of Maroons in 1814, 1815. So you have this evidence here of what happened and what transpired. And then you present all of this and you say, well, as a result of this, we have been held back. We have issues that have caused economic and social deprivation. How are you going to compensate us for this? So that's a little brief overview of the... Now, there's a question here. Can you elaborate on the presence of Africans who were never enslaved on the island? This is separate to the Maroons. Apparently, Africans were being brought illegally in the 1800s. Is this true? Yes, it is true. What we must understand is that when the slave trade was officially ended in 1807, there were many traders, both African and mainly Portuguese, who did not pay any attention to the fact that the slave trade had been abolished. They wanted still to make their money. And there were countries after 1833, 34, non-British countries like Brazil and Cuba, many of the Spanish territories, the Dutch, that had not yet abolished slavery. So they felt that if they were able to round up enslaved people and bring them across the Atlantic to those places, they could still make some money against the international agreement of the slave trade being abolished. And this is what they did. And the ships were very, very rickety. They were not well kept. The crews were not very professional in terms of sailing. And the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, was put out to capture any of these ships that had slaves. They were illegal ships. And what happened in the 1830s, in the case of Dominica, is the Royal Navy captured a couple of these ships. And then the closest port was Dominica. And they brought these ships full of, in one case, 437 enslaved people from Dahomey, Ouida, from Dahomey in West Africa. And of course, as soon as they were landed, they were free people because there was no more slavery in Dominica. It was illegal. And so that's why you have, then the people went and settled in various parts of the island. And up to today, just earlier, I was in a village of Suffrage, and we were chatting, and this woman said, my family were never slaves. And she was one of the descendants of these people who were brought, landed, and were immediately liberated. If the ships were on the African side of the Atlantic Ocean, they usually were brought to Sierra Leone. But when they were on the Caribbean side, they were brought to the islands. And because Dominica had such a small population, usually they bring them into Dominica and they would settle. So that's why we have a number of families who have African names. They never lost their African names. Mingo, Sango, Kofi, and some that even gave themselves the name Africa. Their surname is Africa. Janet Africa, John Africa. So that's why, because we must understand that there were chiefs who had been making a great deal of money on the west coast of Africa, and there were some of them that decided, look, in spite of the fact of the slave trade being abolished, I and my Portuguese, mainly Portuguese cronies, are going to continue to trade. So that's how that happened.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes, certainly. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Honychurch, for all that good information and the presentation. I did post my question in the group chat, but I will just repeat it. Reading your book, In the Forest of Freedom, there are many places in Dominica where I would say, or you pointed out, that various historical events took place during the period of enslavement and colonialization of the island and the peoples. My limited knowledge of Dominica is that it's only the Negma War monument in Roseau which seems to be prominent. Are you aware of any moves where a lot of those other places could become monumental in terms of marking some of that history of Dominica?
Yes. Well, the monument is in the middle of Roseau, and that's the only monument that really exists. They've also preserved the Barracoon building on the bayfront of Roseau, which was one of these places from the 18th century where enslaved people were landed and sales took place. That is also preserved. The marketplace, the old part in Roseau, has been preserved and listed in that regard. It is Jaco Camp, which is up in the middle of the island, and it is a place that is visited a lot by hikers. It's not the easiest place to get to. And there are other sites, mountains, for instance. There is Mont Gros Bois, that is the camp of one of the leaders called Gros Bois. So these places are identified, but you're right in that it is only in the center of Roseau that this statue was put up back in 2013. But the places are recorded and they're identifiable and they're markers. I know that there's a project to do more on the Jaco camp, the site of Jaco, which is up the Layou Valley in the region of the Bells Village. And hikers also, we have a great hiking community in Dominica. So hikers like to go and seek out these places. And the other thing is hardly any archaeological work has been done on any of these sites. And that's something for the future. And we know clearly all about Jaco's camp. So Jaco's camp would probably be the first place to do archaeological investigation. So that's how it stands at present.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Discuss Operation Red Dog. Somebody has asked about some very recent history. They say, can you discuss Operation Red Dog? Well, that's a huge book itself. This is in the early 1981, when there was an attempt to overthrow the government of Prime Minister Eugenia Charles. And mercenaries from Louisiana were hired, and they would link up with certain people in Dominica who were against Eugenia Charles' administration. And the attempt was to overthrow the government. And luckily, along the way, the FBI, for instance, in the States, and the police in Dominica were able to get information, and Operation Red Dog never got off the ground. But that's a huge story. And as a result, the involvement of Patrick John, court cases, he was found guilty of treason, sentenced to serve 12 years, and then that was cut to 4 years. And he went on. He's having a state funeral on Wednesday this week. So that's the Red Dog story that I was asked about. And the question, if we want to ask more questions, well, I suppose there's my email, there are things of that nature that you can contact me. But my problem is I wake up in the morning and I go to bed at night and the phone is ringing and children are asking me questions and students and foreign arrivals and journalists, and I'm inundated. But I do try to find a space now and then. Yeah, somebody mentions here the book, Your Time is Done Now. A very important book because it gives the entire verbatim account of this series of trials related to the Maroons. And there was this one Maroon called Peter who stood up in the dock. I mean, he was going to be executed. And he told the white jury, he said, you can execute me. You know, I know because it's happening right out in the marketplace. Within 50 feet of where they were standing, they were going to be executed. He says, you can execute me, but your time is done now. Whatever you do, your time is done. It's over. And that's how that book got its title, which I think is very moving indeed.
Hi. Can I
Hello
ask
there.
a question? Yes. So I grew up in Dominica and I went to school up until Convent High School, and they never really touched on any Dominican history. I'm in my early 20s, so I don't know, and I'm in the US, so I don't know if the schools are different now, but is there anything being done to get this history taught more in the schools, and even the implementation of Creole and the Kalinago language in the schools?
Well, you raised a very important subject. You see, what happens is that all people in secondary schools, whether it's chemistry or French or whatever, they're studying for the Caribbean Examination Council exam. And in history, it's Caribbean history. And as much as I tell teachers, I say, okay, they are going to be sitting exam papers related to whether it's slavery or political change or federation, but you could use Dominica examples to illustrate. So for instance, you're talking about how a sugar plantation works. There are many sugar plantation ruins in Dominica. You could use a Dominica sugar plantation ruin as an example. But obviously, for instance, in your case, as in many other people's cases, they just stuck to the syllabus that was given to them. And therefore, the Dominica history, because there wasn't an exam for Dominica history, the Dominica history basically was left on the side. And the Caribbean history for the CXC to pass your history exam was what was focused on. So that's why Dominican history has to be a kind of extra, you know. Now, besides that, I think you had, oh yes, you talked about the language. Well, there are efforts. The Kalinago also have a committee. In fact, every day on the radio, they have a little thing about, this is your Kalinago word for the day. They'll give you the Kalinago word and they'll tell you what it means. And then in the case of the Creole, I mentioned earlier that you have your Creole programs, Espérance Creole, and you have the news, and number of books, dictionaries, and so have been produced. And there's a Comité pour Études Creole, which does things. So efforts are being made in this regard, but the problem, of course, is less and less is it a working language. As the American influence and the television influence comes. So you will find children who are living in the urban areas like Roseau, and they will hardly know any Creole at all.
Guilty.
And well, yes, but sometimes it's not your fault. It's just you're growing up in a suburban situation, very often a middle class situation. And I am just lucky that I grew up in the countryside, and that my parents just let me loose. I could do what I want, where I want. So I just absorbed it, and I was in the countryside in the 1950s and 60s, where Creole was very much still spoken. So, but if I had been down in Roseau, in Goodwill, or one of these suburban centers, I certainly would not have had that experience. And I think it's true of a lot of indigenous native languages around the world. So really, you have this. I see somebody say, I think Jacko's Steps also is marked. Yes, it is. You on the main road, there's a section there, you know that it's in this area. And many people visit it. But, and also, yes, I just wanted to say that the Waitugubuli National Trail, which I was on the steering committee, it also makes mention all along the way of the Maroons, and of course in the Kalinago territory about Kalinago life. So there are these panels. Hurricane Maria got rid of some of them, but there's a whole project now being put together to renew all of this. So we'll have that back in order.
May I ask a question?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you so much for your presentation, firstly. It's been wonderful. I have two questions. The first is, are there any kind of African spiritual retentions in any of the major religions in Dominica, like you have in Cuba or Haiti or even Trinidad? And then also the UNIA and Ralph Casimir in Dominica, what were some of the initiatives that they set up in Dominica, apart from investing in the Black Star Line
Black
ship?
Star Line.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, first, yes. So first of all, I'll just deal quickly with J. Ralph Casimir, a very brave guy, because, you know, in a society like that, I was well educated and all, but to bring up and to defend and to speak out for Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and 30s, there were sections of the Dominica society that didn't really approve of all of this. But he did get many people to become members. He got many people to to invest in the Black Star Line. Unfortunately, they never saw any results because of all the complications that were going up in the United States. Casimir, there are letters that I have read where Casimir is begging them to send down somebody to talk, because you know, they've invested money, they're members of the UNIA movement, but they're not seeing anybody, they're not hearing anybody. And that eventually led in 1937 to the visit, not only in Dominica, but throughout the islands, of Marcus Garvey.
I am not sure if Dr. Honychurch is frozen at the moment. Please just give us a few moments.
I just shared, Peter Latang put a message saying that Dominican Creole for Beginners book by Sylvia Henderson Mitchell is a good book. It's absolutely a fantastic book, he's right. I recently ordered that after years of looking for a Creole language book, and the way it's structured and everything, the fact that it's been now accepted as a formal language, and the way it takes you through that book, it's a brilliant resource for anybody wanting to learn Patois or Creole.
Please give us a few moments.
Yes, I think I bought it through Amazon. Yeah.
Hi, while we're waiting, the person who said that there were WhatsApp groups, could they put the links to them in the chat, please?
Good evening, everyone. Just to let you know that Dr. Honychurch seems to have been disconnected, and we are just working on this, and hopefully we can have him rejoin us very shortly. Thank you all for your time and your patience. Just to say, I am loving all of the knowledge sharing in the chat. So please do share any relevant knowledge whilst we work to resolve this issue. Thank you.
Can I just say something really, really quick?
Of course.
I just want to say, like, I'm obviously not a part of like the organisation, but it's been really, really, really brilliant for me today, being of the diaspora, whilst we're waiting for Mr. Honychurch to come back, because there's always been a disconnect in that we have so much passion, but not the connection always. So it's really nice to connect with other people that have the love and the passion of the culture. And that's all I had to say.
Oh, thank you so much for that. That is really appreciated. That is why I set this up, especially for many of us who are of Caribbean, who are coming from Caribbean background, but who have grown up in the UK or different countries. Sometimes you cannot really know so much about your culture, your country of origin. So I'm really glad to hear that. Thank you so much. That is really, really appreciated.
Can I just say, the one thing that I've been fascinated about is, in terms of its size, Dominica is such a small population, but in terms of how it punches above its weight in many areas, from science to right through to sport, people will be fascinated by the amount of professional Dominican sports people, from football to sprinting to you name it. When you mention the links with your Frank Brunos, your Lennox Lewises and stuff like that, a lot of people don't realize the Dominican links there, right through to some of the great footballers. And it'd be very interesting to do a study on the amount of athletes or professors, etc., that Dominica produces compared to the per thousand, compared to not say comparing to other people, but to just celebrate that, because it's incredible how Dominica really punches above its weight.
Yeah, and Paul Canaville of Chelsea as well, the ex-footballer of Chelsea, being like a prime example.
Yeah.
But also in the music and entertainment industry as well, we're really punching above our weight. And if you look at like the younger generation, you've got Shaka, you've got my generation, you've got Shola Amma, you've got Bashi, and all very proud as well. So,
but a lot of the young Dominicans don't realise that link. But in terms of giving them the self-esteem and making them feel, because a lot of people the old-fashioned thing, you're a small line, you're this, that, and other. But it's a small line.
Forget that.
A serious weight,
Forget that small island thing.
Yeah, exactly.
I love my little small island. It's amazing.
Beautiful.
One of the things I think which is noticeable is that Dominica suffers from brain drain, if you like, because being a small island, being somewhere that lacks certain opportunities, and for many of us who may have left the island at a very young age, one of the things we could possibly do in your own groups is to try and encourage more and more young people to visit, and possibly group visits, as opposed to individuals maybe just visiting family members, but do group visits with particular objectives in mind, like, for example, studying part of the history of Dominica, encouraging people to preserve the Creole language. I mean, when I was growing up, now it's language, it's not Creole. So what we can all do within our own community or within our own local groups is encourage a lot of that, going back, visiting, group visits, learning more about the culture, learning more about the history. And the language.
Yes, I am back.
Thank you so much. Mr. Is Dr. Honychurch back? Yes, Dr. Honychurch has returned. So I am now going to go on mute again and allow Dr. Honychurch to continue, and we will just have 10 more minutes of questions. Thank you all so much. Apologies, everyone. I think that there may be an issue with connection. We will just try for another 10 more minutes and see how we go. Thank you all for your patience.
And can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
And yes, thank you so much.
Okay, last speaker, I'm going to turn off the video. Maybe it will help. You'll hear my voice. The last speaker raised a point about groups visiting, and I remember in the 1990s, there was a group from Gateshead that used to visit Dominica every few years. Maybe they made about 4 visits. And it was very revealing for these second generation Dominican people in Britain who came out, and it was in many cases a revelation for them to see the society and how it worked. So I don't know if group visits are a thing of the future after the whole COVID crisis, but that was something which was very effective.
Hello, can I just ask a question?
Yes, that's fine. And then after that, we'll just take 2 more questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's more a modern one, but Dominica is trying to strengthen itself and reinvent itself as like a climate resilient, hurricane resilient island. And I've seen some of the developments that have been going on and some of the housing designs that have been going on. But I'm just wondering, how convinced is Dr. Huniford about some of the designs that I've seen about, you know, safeguarding Dominica for the future?
Yeah, you've raised a very good point, because I am not convinced. I mean, one of my interests, one of my interests is the development of architecture, appropriate and effective architecture in Dominica. I've spoken about it in forums outside of Dominica within the region. And there are 1 or 2 designs which are pretty good, but in the main, the problem is that the people who are designing these buildings very often are from places like Dubai, where, you know, the climate is so totally different. And so the houses that are being put up to rehouse people who've lost their houses have no sort of relevance to the ventilation, to the movement of air.
Yeah.
We have clinics, lovely health clinics, which have recently been constructed. There are no canopies, overhangs, you know, for the arrival of ambulances. And the windows are all glass and they only open to a limited distance. The circulation of air inside is not good. It's you go in there now, there are masses of fans, which if you had designed it properly, you would not need in that. So you have raised a very significant point, but you see, the Dominica of today, people are fearful of raising these points, because then they are seen as, you know, anti-government and look what we're doing to help the people, and you're just bringing negative stuff to bear. That's an issue. So the architecture, I really am appalled in certain cases of what I see.
I'm glad you
simply because.
I'm glad you said that, because I saw some of the designs and I did exactly that. I responded just as a you know, second generation Dominican, responded and says, I said, even if you go online, you'll see better designs online that are like ready-made that could be used compared to what you've got there. They were actually presenting more problems than solutions. And I was quite appalled by it. And it was like I just got locked out of the debate.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you. That's reassuring.
Yeah, I'll just one little addition to what you're saying. I have said, and it's going to be massive maintenance problems for any future people responsible for governments, because of all these things that we've been talking about. The maintenance is going to be really terrible.
Thank you for
So
that.
I'll leave it at that.
So just going to take questions. Was that someone? Okay, the person who's about to speak, I would allow them to speak, and then I can see that there is one more person with a raised hand, and I'll ask them to unmute. So just 2 more people, the person who's about to speak, and then one person who I can see here with a raised hand. Thank you.
Okay, just last question. Since we're talking about the buildings for climate, climate resilience. Recently, the library was set on fire again. And I've been seeing people on Facebook talk about, restoring the building or having it turned into something like completely concrete, which it wasn't before. It's a historic building. So is there anything being done to preserve our historic buildings that are wooden and possibly, even renovating the library to back into a wooden structure?
Well, I have been trying to advocate this for years and years, particularly the library. I put on Facebook, actually set off the discussion on Facebook as a result of the fire. That's the third fire since the hurricane.
Okay.
And I made the point that in 1979, we had that library back in action within months. There was an organization in England that had been set up, the Dominican National Appeal. And we got galvanized and stuff sent out from England on the geese boats. And within months, the library was back in action. But 4 years have passed and nothing has been done. There's a real kind of reluctance. I know that people feel that concrete, cast concrete is the answer to everything. But, there are houses in Dominica. My grandmother's house in Calabishi, wood, entirely wood. It has stood all these hurricanes for 90 years. And there are many other houses like that. It's how you build it and your knowledge of the past techniques. So there are efforts. There's an organization called SHAPE, which tries to promote it. I have done the Cabrits, the Fort Shirley. I restored the Fort Shirley with traditional techniques. And in Maria, the forest around it was totally devastated. And not one sheet of roofing went. And that whole place just stood throughout that storm because it had been done in traditional manner. So it is an issue. It is an issue. It's an educational issue. And it's trying also to convince people that there are techniques that have withstood hurricanes, which can be used again.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Could the person who was asked to unmute please speak, and then we'll just have one more question and then we will then close the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Afia, and thank you, Dr. Honychurch, for your presentation today. I just want to apologise for the repetition because it's a question I've asked in the comments, but I'm really interested to find out just more about my ancestry within Dominica and even maybe going as far back as Africa if possible. I've done a little bit of research myself, but I've been quite limited as to what I could find. So I was just wondering if there are any records or anything you could suggest as to how to go about doing that.
Yeah, our biggest problem in Dominica is that on the 16th of June, 1979, the entire registry building was burnt to the ground. And in that registry building were all of the birth records of Dominican going way, way back. So anybody, it created, they had to pass special legislation, but the records for births, really they end in 1979. There's nothing before that. And it is extremely difficult. I've had to try to assist people. Because of that fire in 1979, it's been virtually impossible to follow families. We also have to remember that actually the laws related to registering of births were only put in place in 1871, so that anybody born before 1871 may not even be registered. So it makes it doubly difficult. And then if you're going into slave records, usually slave records are like one name: Bessie, Johnny, Pearlie, whatever. And surnames were only gradually introduced, particularly after slavery was over. In the case of the indigenous people, when they were baptizing them, mainly as adults, they took the name of their mainly French godparents. So you'll find somebody who is called Sorrento, but they're not necessarily related to Sorrento family at all. Their godparents were Sorrentos in 1740, and they were baptized and they were given that surname. That's why you find in the territory, the indigenous people, their surnames are mainly French: Valmont, Ogis, Daru, Durand, all those names. So it really is extremely difficult. You get to a point and it's extremely difficult to go further because of particularly that destruction of the registry. So that's my answer to that one.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant.
So thank you. Thank you all very much. No, I was just going to say my little piece to thank everybody for their interest, and I'm still getting accustomed to dealing with all this technology, but I apologize for problems at the beginning and the little hitches here and there. But I hope that we have had an interesting discussion over the last couple hours this afternoon and evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Honychurch. Thank you. Just before we close, I just have one final question for you. Someone has been really wanting to ask this question. And the question is, the indigenous peoples in Guyana died out from European diseases brought in. However, it seems that the situation was different in Dominica. They were never enslaved, but were allowed their freedom. Would you be able to speak on this a little bit?
Yeah, just to say that in Guyana, the situation I think is a little exaggerated in that comment, because up in the interior of Guyana, there are indigenous communities that really still survive, and they are very, very active indeed. So the problem is exposure. You see, the fact of Dominica was that its mountains protected it, its late colonization, the fact that it was difficult to colonize and therefore many people gave up. Many British people who came to build and put things gave up. And then, of course, the whole situation that the indigenous people retreated to the east of the island, which is the most rugged, and therefore were able to survive. And also, I had a little program on that and some other platform, showing that they were also able to survive because of their isolation, survive these diseases that were introduced, like smallpox and influenza and stuff, that were introduced by the Europeans, but which the indigenous people had no immunity to, because their bodies had never developed the immunity because those diseases never existed. But because of their isolation, because of their retreat into the east coast and the rugged mountains, they gradually were able to, survive and deal with these situations. So that's the advantage that the indigenous people of Dominica had. As I said, just to recap, in the case of Guyana, yes, you had a lot of people, particularly in the coastal areas, the areas that had sugar plantations and so. But the further back you got, way up beyond the Rupununi, the groups survive, and they actually, make a big thing about their survival. So I'll leave it there.
Wow, thank you for that incredible answer. Thank you for that, Dr. Honychurch. Please, can we give a huge clap for Dr. Honychurch for his time this evening? It has been incredible. Thank you. I am now
Thank you.
I am now
Thank
going
you.
to end the event. It has been brilliant. I have some thank yous because, of course, I did not do this on my own. I would like to thank Dr. Honychurch for so kindly agreeing to speak this evening and to impart his knowledge this evening. It has been incredible. I've made loads of notes. I will be putting this on our YouTube channel because I too will want to watch this again. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Honychurch. I would like to thank the Caribbean Links team for all their help and hard work. I work with a brilliant team, one of the members was here this evening, and I am greatly, greatly appreciative of all of their help and time. I would like to thank all of you, the guests, for tuning in and participating and knowledge sharing. It has been brilliant. It has been truly, truly wonderful and a very fruitful evening. This is just to let you know that our next virtual event will be in November. We have yet to decide what that event topic will be, but we will keep you updated. Please follow us at Links Caribbean on social media, and we will be in touch very soon to let you all know what our next event will be. But please do keep November in your mind, because that will be when our next event will be. Once again, it's been an absolute pleasure this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Honychurch, and we will see you soon. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you for your time to everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you all very much, and thank you, Dr. Honychurch. I've been longing to come face to face with you.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing.
Bye.
Really good.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.